Hi folks, welcome to the Laney College machine shop. Today we're going to be taking apart this electric motor. Electric motors are devices which convert electrical energy to mechanical energy. So when you energize the motor, the shaft will spin. That's what they do. There are lots of different kinds of electric motor, and if you look at the nameplate on this thing, you'll see various specifications for this particular motor. But you know what? They basically all do the same thing in slightly different ways, and we don't need to concern ourselves with any of that because we're going to be focusing on the mechanical system here. We'll be looking at how this is constructed, how to take it apart, and how to put it back together without breaking it. We're going to be using a number of hand tools today, and the first one is this very nice kit filled with combination wrenches, sockets, various drivers, an adjustable wrench, Allen wrenches, things like that. But we're actually not going to use all the stuff in here. In fact, we're only going to use a few of the things in here. So we are specifically going to be using the 1/4 inch socket and the 5/16 socket. And those are the ones that have the 1/4 inch drive on them that fits, that fits this nut driver. So there's a little attachment that goes into the end of this that has a hexagonal head on it. And then it has a square on the other side with a little spring-loaded ball. And that's what these can go on. Okay, so that's going to be for removing the heads of the fasteners, the screws that are on the motor. So I'm going to set those aside for now. There are a number of different tools in here that will do basically the same job. There are many ways to skin a cat, right? So there's no one right way to do anything. I'm just going to show you one way to do it that works pretty well. So let me fold that back up, and let's look at a couple of these other tools. So in addition to the driver with the 2 sockets, we're going to need a hammer, okay? But it should be a dead blow hammer or soft-faced mallet. This has, it's like plastic or some kind of rubber on it. So this is so that you can beat on things without deforming the surface, damaging the surface. We're also going to be using some wood. I actually don't know exactly how many pieces we'll need or if we'll need any at all, but it's always very nice to have them around. So an electric motor is a very, very, very simple machine. And that's great news because they are also by far and away the most common machine in the world. So it's a good thing that they're simple. It's really nothing more than a shaft that goes all the way through the part. It's held in bearings here, and then there's an enclosure. You'll see all of this in more detail in just a moment when we take this apart, but that's useful information to know for our sort of overall strategy here. What we're going to do is we're going to loosen this end cover here and this end cover here, and then those will come out and we can pull the shaft out through one side. Very simple. Okay, so let's start with this side here. We're going to go ahead and remove this plate right here, which is an electrical cover for the wiring. We're going to use the driver with the 1/4 inch socket on it to remove these screws right here. So there's one. I mean, you can see that there is a little slot there so that you could use a flathead screwdriver to remove these, but flathead screwdrivers are really the worst if you've ever had the unfortunate experience of having to deal with one, so I really prefer these sockets. So you can see the wiring in there. We're not going to do wiring here today, but it would be a very simple thing to do it. Now, regarding the parts that we're taking off, as we remove this stuff, we really want to keep it all together. So a lot of times you'll put it into bins, or you'll put it into Ziploc bags or something like that, but it's important to keep all this stuff together so that you don't lose it and you don't forget where it's supposed to go. I'm just going to set it out of the way over here. There aren't that many parts, but I am going to keep everything together. Another thing is that when you're disassembling a machine like this, you really do want to keep a record of how it was all put together to begin with. So I really highly recommend taking pictures as you're disassembling something. Really helps in the reassembly. You have access to this video, so you don't really need to do that here, but it is a good thing to remember going forward. And while we're on the topic of best practices for assembly, there is one more thing that I would like to mention, and that is match marking. Components like this end cover, which we actually call an end bell, have a number of different positions in which you can put them back. It's a good idea to make sure that the components go back in exactly the same orientation as they were before disassembly. And that's where match marking comes in. Match marking can be as simple as taking like a Sharpie or something and just marking the two components where they meet together. That way when you reassemble them, you can just line up those marks and you know that they went back together in almost exactly the same position. Now this is permanent marker, but still it'll rub off with time. So sometimes people will actually physically deform by like punching or hitting with a chisel the material to make permanent marks in the material for match marking. And sometimes, as in the case down here, the manufacturer has already match marked the part. So that's very, very handy. Anyway, however you want to do it, as long as you do it. Okay, now we're ready to remove this end bell, and that's these 4 screws. Very, very long screws, as you'll see. And we are now going to switch from the 1/4 inch socket to the 5/16 socket. And just give these a twist to loosen them, and then you can even remove them by hand. You can see how long those are here. Those actually go all the way through, and the threads are over in the other end bell. Anyway, let's get those things out of there. All right, and then put those to the side. All right, so hopefully this will come right off, and we just need to see if we can pull on it a little bit. Well, it doesn't seem like it wants to come out. Oh, there it is. So it's kind of sort of still stuck, and so that means that it's stuck on the shaft a little bit. Let's see if we can work it loose a little bit. Maybe not. Okay, let's try something else. Instead of just trying to force this method, it clearly doesn't want to come off. So let's try going from the other side. Okay, so we should be able to push the shaft all the way through from this side, and it'll come out all as one piece with this end bell still attached. Now, one thing that we have to do is loosen these screws right here, because these screws retain the bearing, which is just right there on the other side of this material. So we're going to use the 5/16 socket again. Loosen those, and you don't need to completely loosen them. You just need to give them a turn or two. And now we should be able to push this. Oh, there it is. Now it wants to go. All right. There it is, and there's the shaft with the ball bearings, one here and one right there. This part right here is called the rotor, and it's involved with the electromagnetic system that makes the shaft spin. Anyway, we still need to remove the end cap off of this bearing. So again, let's see if it wants to come off. No. Oh. Oh. So I think it's binding a little bit. Okay, so I've got a better idea. Okay, the first thing we need to do is remove this plastic cover for the wires. So to do that, we have to switch back over to the 1/4 inch socket and remove those screws. And then set that aside. Okay, now we're going to need a couple pieces of wood. Right, so 2 just like that, and then the other 2 perpendicular, so that we can sit the bottom of the rotor, these little like fins on the wood. But the bottom here, the end bell, can still rotate. Okay, and then gently with the soft face mallet, okay, I'm going to tap down on the end bell. And you can see that I'm rotating it every now and then because I really want this to come off evenly. I don't want it to get cocked out at some angle because then it will seize on the shaft. There we go. Came right off after just a little bit of persuasion. So here's the shaft, and one thing that you'll notice is that there's actually this little like wavy washer that was attached to the end of this bearing, and there's a little bit of oddly colored blue grease on there. This is an important part. It's like a little spring, and that is supposed to go in between the end bell and the bearing. So that just goes right in there. Now, one of the very convenient things about this wood here is that it's got this slot cut in it. So that keeps the shaft from rolling around on the table, which it definitely will do and will roll right off onto the floor. So that is a nice convenient feature. Now let's look at the stator, okay? So there's the rotor, which is the rotational piece, and then there's the stator, which is the non-rotational piece. We've already removed one end bell, but there is another one which needs to be removed, and that one should just come off. If we can pull it off the end there, it doesn't really want to go. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll kind of punch it off. So it looks like I lied. We are going to need one more tool to correctly disassemble this thing. By the way, it's always good to have a strategy before you start working on something, but you never know exactly how it's going to go, so it's also very important to be adaptable. So we're going to use this tool right here. This is actually a set of drive pin punches. They're really just hardened steel sticks that you use to beat on things. For our application, really any size will do. All we want to do is put it behind these little, like, there's sort of these tabs right here, raised material. And that's so that you can put the pin directly behind it and then tap it with a hammer. And it helps if somebody holds the motor down for you, or if you clamp it down, but let's see if I can get it. Boom, baby! There it goes. And you can see here on the back side these little clips that were used to retain the bearing so that the whole shaft doesn't come out like that, right? So when we wanted to remove the shaft, we had to turn these, and when you turn those little clips move out of the way. And that's why we didn't have to loosen those screws entirely. We just had to back them off enough so that the clips rotated out of the way. Anyway, so now we've got this thing completely apart. And there are all the parts right there. Very satisfying to see them all laid out like that. So just to summarize, we've got the stator, which is the non-rotating part of the machine. And you can actually see in here what are called the stator windings. Okay, so these are actually copper electrical wire that has to do with the electromagnetic system that makes the motor shaft spin. We've got the cover for the electrical wiring and this square key, which goes on the shaft. We've got the two end bells, the front bell and the rear bell. We've got this plastic enclosure, which housed the wiring. We've got these 4 long screws, which fastened the two end bells to each other. And then we've got the shaft with 2 bearings on either end. Now, before we can call this fully disassembled, we actually have to take off those bearings. So let's talk about that now. To remove the bearings, we're going to use this hydraulic press. We're going to remove this bearing first. So we need to slip this through these 2 pieces here, and then these other 2 pieces, kind of sandwich the bearing just like that. And you want to center the shaft so that it's right underneath this piece right here. This is actually the ram of the hydraulic press. This is what does all the pushing. To remove the bearing, we need to push the shaft out from inside of it. And that's because the fit between the bearing and the shaft is super, super tight. You can't get them apart unless you force them apart like this. So because we're going to be pressing out the shaft, we need to use this little piece right here. It's just a little piece of brass that will push just on the shaft itself and not on the bearing. And then we're going to turn this, which gets this, the end of the ram here, to the point where it's touching, touching that brass part. And then we got to turn this thing, make sure that it's locked, so clockwise to lock it, righty-tighty, lefty-loosey is the saying. And then we pull down on this to exert downward force on the shaft. Now, before I go cranking on this thing in earnest, I have to mention that this shaft, once it frees from the bearing, is going to come shooting out pretty fast. So you need to have, ideally, another person holding the shaft to catch it when it comes out. And even then, you definitely want to have like a safety bucket filled with something soft, so that if you accidentally don't catch the shaft, it falls into something soft instead of against the hard floor, which would definitely damage the shaft. Okay, here we go. See, wants to come. It's not going to take much. Almost there. All right, there we go. And I was able to catch the shaft. We have another bearing to take off, so we need to retract the hydraulic cylinder here. And all we have to do that is loosen that. You can see it retracts. Okay, and then we can tighten it back down again. And we're ready to start cranking on the other side. Okay, we need to retract the screw a little bit to make a little bit more room, because this side of the shaft is a little bit taller. But it's basically the same thing as before. Okay. Something like that. That should fit nice and snug right there. And we don't need the piece of brass this time, because we can directly access the shaft at the top. Bring this down just a hair so that it touches. Okay. Same song, second verse. It's almost there. There we go. And that's the other side pressed off as well. So now with the bearings removed, we can officially call this motor disassembled. But here's the thing. Taking things apart is easy. Putting them back together again is much harder to do. And we need to put this thing back together so that the next group can take it apart. So let's do that now. And it's basically just the reverse of the process we used to disassemble it. And that means, of course, that we've got to go back over to the hydraulic press. In order to put the bearings back on the shaft, we're going to need to drop this platform like 2 rungs. So go ahead and put this handle on the square drive and crank up a little bit to relieve some pressure so that you can remove these 2 posts. Now you can crank the entire platform down. 2 holes. Okay. And then slide these back in. And then relieve the tension on this wire here so that it's not tight. Okay, so this is the second side. Slip that down there. Okay, and then the pipe goes on top. And then it looks like we're going to have to extend the ram a little bit. All right, looks pretty good. And then let's crank on it. Okay, so we're watching for that right there, that gap right there. As soon as there's no more gap and the bearing is all the way against that face, then we're done. Getting very close. All right, and that's it. When I'm putting an electric motor back together, I think it's actually easiest to do it vertically. So you sort of start with the one side of the motor and then you stack the components up in this orientation. That way you're working with rather than against gravity. So we're going to need 2 pieces of wood, just like that. First part is going to be this end bell that went on the front of the motor. So we're going to go ahead and stick the shaft through that. So the long side, right? So this is like the short side and this is the long side. So long side goes through first. And then the bearing should just slip through just like that. And then we can install the stator. So the stator goes straight down like so. And you really want to make sure that you line up those match marks. So this will have to be turned just a little bit. Whoop. Right there. And just to make sure that these are really nicely seated, I'm going to give it just a couple taps, a few taps with the dead blow hammer. Okay, and now we can put the other end bell on, but we have to make sure that we put this little plastic electronic enclosure back on. So that just fits on there like that. And then we use the 1/4-inch socket to tighten that down. All right, now we're going to flip this over and put it on, but we have to make sure that that little spring, that sort of wavy washer, doesn't fall out. And there's a little bit of grease in there, and the grease should keep it in place, but just watch out for that. And if it falls out, make sure you put it back. And as we install this, we want to thread the wires through this little hole, like so. Okay? And again, we want to line up the bearing with its hole. And we also want to line up those match marks, just like that. And again, just give it a little tap all the way around. Make sure that it seats nicely. All right, tuck that away. Okay, and now we need to thread these long screws through. And this is where doing it vertically really, really helps, because otherwise these things are very difficult to line up. So let's get that through. See if we can start it in the hole on the other side. And remember, we need the 5/16 socket for these. So let's see. Looks like I got it. Okay, so I'm going to get that pretty close, but I'm not going to get it all the way tight. Okay, I'm going to leave it a little bit loose just in case this needs to turn a little bit for all of the other screws to engage. Sometimes it takes a moment to find the right spot, so be a little bit patient. Occasionally it helps to flip this over and shine a light with a flashlight through the other side so that you can see where the screw is. Okay, there we go. So again, not going to get that one all the way tight. I'm going to back it off a little bit so it's slightly loose. And we'll do the other two. Okay, so that's all of them. So now I am going to tighten all of them down. And I'm going to go sort of across the circle to make sure that this gets pulled down evenly. All right, and now I'm going to put this cover and gasket back on, just like that. Start those screws. 1/4-inch socket. Tighten those down. They don't need to be super tight, just snug. Okay, and the very, very last thing that we need to do is flip this over. Don't need the wood anymore. And back to the 5/16 socket to tighten these. Remember, those are for the clips that retain the bearing on this side. So just tighten those down. All right. And with that, we are done. The final test, of course, to make sure that this thing went back together correctly is to give the shaft a little spin, and it does spin. It doesn't feel like it's binding anywhere, so we're good to go. I hope you enjoyed that. Taking electric motors apart and putting them back together, usually replacing things like bearings when they go bad, is a super, super common industrial maintenance type job. So if you found that enjoyable, then I think you would really enjoy being an industrial maintenance mechanic. Thanks for watching.